going to go ahead and get started. After we've had that nice lunch, everybody's ready for a nap. Okay, I'm going to close this door because it's a little bit of distraction. And maybe we can put down some of these shades so that we have decent light. Oh, that looks pretty good. So we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about technology. I'm going to run over a few quick review slides on biomass. Some of this material was covered already this morning, and kind of set up the stage for some of the different conversion technologies that are out there. Lots been happening in the last few years on woody biomass, bioenergy conversion. Although the focus of this workshop is really on electricity because of that SB 1122 legislation is really about converting biomass to electricity. We do have technology that can do a lot of other things in the bioenergy arena. Peter, I don't know how this thing works.
It's the little red, this guy, is the pointer.
Okay. There's a button there I can't see without my glasses on. So woody biomass, I mean, we've already had some people talking about this, where it is. Most of the conversation this morning has been focused on that forest-based, non-merchantable tree, shrubs, harvest residues, that sort of thing. The ladder fuels that Jana started off talking about this morning. But we have other streams of woody biomass that may not fit into this SB 1122 legislation, but anybody who's doing a biomass power plant knows well what these biomass streams are. There's an urban woody waste stream, particularly when you're in close to urban areas, that provide a lot of fuel for biomass power plants. Construction debris, demolition wood, post-consumer wood products, tree removals and prunings, all that stuff you get out of the urban environment. Also the wood manufacturing residue. This one's kind of a funny topic in the biomass world these days. That log that's going through a sawmill, about half of that is wood residue. You're only going to get half of that log that's lumber. The rest of it is residue. Most of that residue has had a home for higher value uses in the past. It can go into particle board plants, oriented strand board, or other kind of composite panels, pulp chips, into the pulp market. It can go into animal bedding, big market in animal bedding. Some of it can go into agricultural land soil amendments, particularly in biomass power plants that are down in the Central Valley have a market for that. So just because it's residue from the lumber manufacturing process doesn't mean that it's biomass that's available for a power plant, because a power plant, by definition almost, has to work on the lowest value fuel. And that's why when we see power plants in the Central Valley, they're operating more off of agricultural residues than they are off of woody residues, or the forest-based residues, because of the cost difference. Ag residues come in at cheaper, and wood manufacture, the urban waste stream is the lowest value cost. I'm challenged with this button here. And also the ag residues part has a lot of orchard prunings in it. The woody biomass that comes out of ag residues. A lot of orchards in California, and those orchards have a limited lifespan. They're ripped up and replanted. And depending on the crop, from 10 to 50 years, somewhere in that window. So there's a lot of wood residue, woody biomass that's coming out of those as well. So we have all of this, including chaparral, could be part of the woody biomass stream, but it's a very high cost thing to deal with, and we don't see much happening with that at all. The thing that I wanted you to take home from this is that from a lot of these streams, some of the cost of that material is taken up by other products. The landfill diversion part, there's tipping fees, things go into landfills, so that's offsetting some of the costs of that biomass. Sawmill residues, the lumber is offsetting some of those costs, so it's a lower value use, or lower cost biomass feedstock. Logging residues, same thing. The higher value timber is offsetting some of that cost. Ag residues, the crops, the agricultural crops are offsetting some of those costs. The one where we don't have anything that's really offsetting that is the fuel reduction, the thinning, the salvage from dead and dying trees, the forest-based woody biomass there's really nothing that's offsetting that cost unless it's tied to a logging situation that has some higher value products on it. So, many people pointed this out. There's a lot of positive attributes about woody biomass in the forest, but too much of a good thing causes us problems. We talked already about the wildfires, the habitat for destructive insects and tree disease hasn't been brought up, but we see that a lot in the forests in California in drought years, particularly where we can have insect outbreaks that can create a lot of biomass for the market. So it's a real problem that we need to deal with. We know that there's some real incentives to work with this material. Fire is a big focus in this state, but also a more efficient use of our renewable resource. We've also heard about improving air quality, all those things. These are all really important considerations. We know we have a good market, a lot of good reasons to use woody biomass, and the market is out there. What we have to connect the dots to is getting this as a resource into the stream of a feedstock for products, and particularly bioenergy products is what we're talking about. When I look at biomass, I see wood fiber. And if we can take wood fiber, we can break it down to wood fiber, we can make lots of products, value-added products. And the list goes on and on. But I did want to point out just a couple things and why we're looking at low-value products for biomass, because the wood quality of those small trees is pretty inferior to bigger trees. It's a well-known fact. There's a central core in this tree that's not showing up on this slide, unfortunately, of about 10 years of growth in the middle of this tree, no matter where we look, a nice cylinder, that's inferior wood quality. And then small trees, that's a big part of that tree. That juvenile wood zone doesn't make good lumber. So the small trees have never been a good feedstock for lumber products, so we're always looking at some other products to put it into. And that's where we get into looking at the electricity production, because it is a market for that lower value material. But there's issues around it. We can also take that wood and break it down to its individual constituents. It's made up of these chemical groups: cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, extractives, and ash. That sums up everything that's in that block of wood. These are sugars that can be fermented into alcohol. That's the old technology, has been around for a long time. Lignin is a pretty high energy feedstock that's getting closer to the values of coal than it is to wood in terms of energy content. A lot of high value extractives, chemicals in trees that can be used, extracted out and used for other things. We can do a lot with wood, but when we're looking at that biomass as a feedstock for all those products, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to get them into higher value products because of the costs associated in cleaning up that low value, low quality feedstock to the point where it can feed into some of these other higher value markets. That's extra cost that's added along the way. So we kind of range these things as particular potential products for biomass feedstock. These, we all know about these, the soil additives, compost, that sort of thing, your combustion fuel chips, fuel pellets. We can get into some higher value uses that's going to cost more to get to those products, but those are also, and we're going to talk about these technologies in about 5 minutes. Unlikely, because of the cost of refining that low value feedstock into raw material for composite panels or fiberplastic composites, or even nanofibers, very, very small carbon fibers that can be used for lots of innovative products. Unlikely that we're going to see biomass as a feedstock for those because it is at low value. This is the situation now. It's ground up in tub grinders. It's chipped in the forest during logging operations, during harvesting. And the big market for it really is the power plant. This is the power plant over here in Fairhaven. I took that photo 10 years ago. About a 40-month supply of 4 months of supply of fuel chips there to provide a, I don't remember, 20 megawatt power plant? Who in the audience knows? 18? And then we can also take it through some other bio or organic chemistry processes to convert it into high-value organic fuels. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. So it's important to worry, I mean, because we can do this, we're eliminating that problem of juvenile wood when we break it down and mix it back together to make other products, but we add cost to doing it. I just wanted to throw this up as kind of a neat little example. 15,000 BTUs is represented by each one of these pictures. That's enough wood in those to make 15,000 BTUs, or enough to produce about a kilowatt of electricity. I just wanted to point home to you the density issue here. Solid wood comes in at about 25 pounds a cubic foot. Fuel chips at about 13, almost half of that. So you can see that once we chip fuel, we're moving a lot of air. We got smaller particles that don't pack very well. But we can take it through some kind of a densification process, produce fuel pellets, and we've increased that density up to about 40 pounds per cubic feet, or even under higher pressure into these bricks at 55 pounds per cubic feet. And something that, oh, I have a button. I wander when I talk. Peter said there was a button there. There it is. A lot of interest in torrefied pellets recently. These fuel pellets are a developing market. You've seen them in the residential end of things for pellet stoves, the same thing. It's also a commercial product, industrial use of these. The biggest market for it is actually in Europe, England of all places, because England has a lot of coal power plants. And they're co-firing coal power plants with wood fiber, and these pellets are a good way of transporting that. But torrefied pellets are higher energy content and higher density, and you get rid of some of the volatiles in the wood itself, and you get more of just a carbon product that is a more durable feedstock. These wood pellets tend to fall apart when they get wet. Torrefied pellets do not. So it's a developing market, and we're starting to see plants being built in Canada and back east. Maine is putting in a big one. A lot of the southeast part of the country is putting a lot of new plants for these wood pellets. Almost all of that market is offshore. It's in Europe. So there's a real advantage to working with that feedstock to get some higher value at it, but remember, you're adding costs as you go along. And so it all comes down to that economic equation. The conversion pathways I want to talk about. Combustion is the simplest one. Everybody knows you can burn wood to produce heat. It's not a secret. Most people know by now that we can create electricity from that heat. We can boil water, make steam, run a turbine with the steam, we're producing electricity. Some other thermochemical processes, pyrolysis and gasification, are ones that are starting to get a lot of interest, and I'll talk a little bit about what those are in a minute. You can see that we have a much wider range of products that we can produce from that, depending on the chemistry that we put these through. We can get heat out of it. We can combust the products from pyrolysis or gasification and do that electricity route. But we can actually also convert it into biodiesel, into alcohols like ethanol, and other higher value organic chemicals. Can do the same thing by anaerobic digestion of organic materials. You don't see that very much with wood, but it is a possibility. Hydrolysis and fermentation has been around for a long time. It's the original commercial process for making ethanol, was to hydrolyze wood, actually break it down into those sugars that I mentioned earlier, taking those sugars and fermenting them with a yeast, and the yeast produces alcohol. And that's a simple process, and it's been around for a long time. Can make ethanol, and corn is the cellulosic ethanol from corn stalks and things like that. Some of that, it goes through a hydrolysis fermentation process. So we have this pathway. The other pathway is even more elaborate, and I'm not going to really focus on that. It's sort of a developing area with more heat and pressure and lots of catalysts, different kinds of catalysts. We can produce a whole range of high-value organic chemicals. So those are the pathways. Coming back to my point about we can do this. We have these technologies. We look at our biomass, our raw material going in. It's going through some harvesting, some collection, transporting it to some location where we have to prepare that feedstock, get it into some kind of a process. We have a residue stream coming out of that. We're getting a product out of that. All along the way, we're creating some emissions from all these things. We're adding energy in. We're adding money in. Somehow we have to balance all of this. We have to get more money or energy out of this in our product stream than we're putting in for this to be an efficient process. And all of these technologies I'm going to talk about work in theory. When we get down to the economic reality, it's much more difficult to make this work, to get that value product out of it. The reason that one of the reasons we're interested in this is kind of what our energy demand looks like in the United States. It's quadrillion BTUs. Does anybody know how much a quadrillion BTU is? It's a big number. That's our energy demand. It doubled from 1960 to about the year 1990. In about 50 years, we've doubled our energy demand in this country. You see interesting things about, recession periods where you see it starting to level off, but then the economy picks up, demand picks up. You can look at these numbers in lots of different ways. Our per capita energy use is actually coming down. Problem is we're adding more capitas. We're adding more people. Population keeps the increase. So we have a real energy demand situation that is not, and we all know we had a recession in what year was that? I lost all my money. I forget what it was now. Block that one out. And you're starting to see the economy pick up. Guess what? The energy demand picks up. Industrial use is dropping down, but we're adding more people. You can look at these numbers in different ways, but that's the overall picture for the energy demand. And it's not going to change. So who made the comment about we need all the tools in the toolbox? It was you, right? We can't say, well, it's too hard to use biomass to make an energy product. It's not working. It costs too much. We know we have some technology to work. We know we can tweak that technology to make it more efficient. We know we can work on getting those costs under control. We have to make all those things work so we have that tool in our toolbox. Because it's important. Because we have a situation, the global carbon cycle, and this is just a very crude look at it, but we have forests and other vegetation and soils that take carbon out of the atmosphere. They also decompose and they put carbon into the atmosphere. They're taking in more than they're putting out, so that's a good thing. Our oceans, same thing. They're taking in carbon. They're also putting out some carbon, but they're taking in more than they're putting out, so that's a good thing. This is where our problem comes in. That human activity is putting that 6.3 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere, and it's not taking any of it back. And it's mostly from fossil fuels. So we have an unbalance in the carbon cycle. Again, woody biomass can play an important role in this, because if we can get energy out of products that are deteriorating anyway, if we can extract some energy out of that, that's a real positive thing, because we're not taking fossil fuels. We're now taking a carbon source that's going into the atmosphere, but we're getting some energy out of it on its way instead of letting it all just dissipate. So it's a good thing. Real quickly, California energy, electricity production, since we're going to focus on electricity for the next 5-10 minutes, this is what it looks like in the state. And, oops, wrong button. How far did I go there? The slide is not showing up. I know you can't see this. This is kind of the breakdown of electricity generation in California and showing you what the different categories are. And boy, I have to work on the slide because I can't even see it right now. But the big one here is natural gas. 61% of our electricity is coming from natural gas, about 1% from coal, 6% from geothermal, 6% solar wind, nuclear at about 9%, hydro 14%, biomass at 3%. What you can't see is what it was in the year 1999. Biomass is about the same. It was 2.5% of the electricity production was in 1999. Solar and wind is going up from 1.9% to 6%. A lot more investment going on in that solar and wind production. Coal is about the same. It has actually dropped dramatically from 16% to 1%. Natural gas is the big gainer from about 30%, 37% up to 60%. So we're seeing a big shift occurring in how we're producing electricity in the state, but the biomass part is pretty much staying the same. We do have biomass power plants. We have currently operating somewhere between 27 and 30 in the state. The triangles are cogeneration facilities attached to sawmills. There's color-coded depending on size, but they range in size from about 6 megawatts up to about 50 megawatts. And it's consuming about 4.5 million bone-dry tons per year of those power plants. And its breakdown is about a third, forest biomass, manufacturing residue, and quarter, landfill diverted and ag residues. And that hasn't changed too much over the years. But again, focus on, this is the highest cost biomass. These are much lower. So the biomass power plants are going to be more interested in using those as their feedstock rather than the forest base, which creates a bit of a problem for us when we're trying to reduce some of that forest fuel loading particularly. And it's only about 15% of the total biomass available in the state. So there's a lot of opportunity for getting more biomass into any energy stream. So a little bit on technology. Combustion, very simple technology. You all have a basic understanding of it. Remember that my black box earlier on, we have an emission stream, we have a biomass going in, we have our process, we have combustion is using air to combust the material, producing some emissions, and inorganic ash stream, heat, and the heat can be used to produce electricity through steam. Pretty simple. We've had earlier talk today about concern about particulates from combustion. The larger you get in size, the more you have to be concerned about cleaning up those particulates. And these are the emission products that that air quality people are concerned about. So that's a pretty simple pathway. If you want to compare that to what natural gas combustion looks like compared to wood combustion, this is a pretty graphic way of looking at that. Natural gas is a cleaner fuel. No question about it. Natural gas is the blue box, wood is the brown box. Wood boilers are producing a lot more particulates, they're producing more NOx, and they're producing more carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide than natural gas. So it's not as clean of a fuel. That's a reality. So we have other control technologies that go onto power plants particularly to handle the emissions from particulates. It's a simple process, a basic heat system, combustion box. The air is going in with the fuel, it's being burned, producing the heat. There's usually some kind of direction of the secondary combustion going on where the heat is higher up here, so you get more complete combustion. Through some kind of a heat exchanger that's extracting the heat from that flue gas. The heat's going one path, the flue gas out the stack, and that's the simple technology behind combustion. They all similarly look like that. Come in a variety of sizes. At the scale we're talking about today, there's a few manufacturers, Chiptech, Messerschmitt, and KOB. There's a lot of others that design combustion furnaces to space heat at a smaller scale. Lots of them online and available. You can find out a lot of information about them. So we kind of look at scale as an important issue. You got the small scale, moderate scale, and large scale. The power plants that we have in operation right now, those 27 I showed you, are in that greater than 20 million BTUs per hour, small scale and moderate scale. The thing I want you to take home from this is that we do have some concerns with these operations as to whether, if they're not an automated fuel supply, you need to have an on-site operator. That adds a cost. These moderate scale ones typically are automated fuel supplies, so there's not as much intervention involved there, but the cost of these systems is going up, and they're usually heating hot air or hot water. You get up into the large scale, now you need to have a continuous operator on site 24/7, as long as that thing is operating. So your costs again go up with that. And then we're subject to those EPA emissions rules as well. Typical power plant looks like that. It's the same picture I showed you earlier. If you haven't seen one, some of you were on that field tour yesterday. The boiler, the working end of the business right here, the boiler and generator in there, 4 months supply of biomass fuel going into the combustion chamber, producing the heat and the steam and the generator in there. This is all the air emissions cleanup, the electrostatic precipitator that's taking out the particulates, handling the emissions. A plant like that, 20 megawatt capacity, approximately is processing about 150 to 180,000 bone dry tons per year. At a value somewhere in there between $20 and $55 per bone dry ton for the fuel. The lower end of this would be as urban woody waste or ag residues. The higher end would be the forest-based fuel. It's the fact of life. They mix the fuels together and try and come up with a cost that they can produce electricity. Most of those power purchase agreements are operating somewhere in the neighborhood of about right now from 8 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour. It's costing them in the range of 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. They're not making a lot of money on this. And sometimes they're losing money. So depending on when they got that power purchase agreement, it reflects the cost that they're actually getting paid for their electricity. They're coming in at about that kind of a production cost. And their installed cost is pretty high, $3,000 to $5,000 per kilowatt. So you can do the math and figure out that these power plants aren't making a lot of money, but they are an important part of that puzzle, that tool in the toolbox. This happens to be a cogeneration facility at a sawmill. Again, you have the same thing, the steam boiler and electrical generator, the emissions control unit. I didn't show you cooling towers in the other one, but typically these power plants, and somebody mentioned this earlier, are losing their heat. They're producing electricity from that steam, and then the steam has to cool down to get back into the boiler. That heat is lost to the atmosphere through cooling towers. Well, in a cogeneration facility, these are only there if they need them. What they're typically doing is taking their steam from here through these pipes to a series of dry kilns where they're drying their lumber and offsetting about $750,000 in energy costs, drying the lumber from the excess heat that's in that steam. So that's where your efficiency goes up now to about 70%, rather than the 20% that it is in a standalone power plant that's losing all of that heat. So this makes a lot more sense to be able to find a market for the heat that's coming off of these power plants. And this particular power plant is selling their electricity over the history of this plant between 6 and 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and their power purchase agreement is ending next year, and they haven't been able to get it renegotiated at a higher rate that they can make money off of this, so they don't know whether they'll be able to keep this operating. So it's kind of not a good ending to that story. So we have concerns with biomass combustion. The availability and cost of fuel definitely drives up the cost of the power produced. The emissions, it is a complicated story. We have particulates we have to clean up. We also have some arguments about, putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and the whole conversation about carbon flux from plant materials into the atmosphere. It is a complicated story, but my point being that if we're going to lose that carbon anyway as wood deteriorates, let's get some energy out of it along the way. Higher maintenance costs than using biomass, and we have grid internet challenges that were mentioned earlier. When you want to interconnect to the grid, there are very strict rules on how you do that. There are costs associated with doing that, and those costs can get to be quite high. Peter's going to talk a little bit about more of that later. So we have good pros and cons. It's a good system. It's something that we need to keep available for producing electricity, but there are other opportunities that we can look at in other technologies. We want to keep these operating, but we also have to worry about changing rules. EPA is looking at boiler MACT rules, tailoring rules right now. That really is a maximum available control technology. They're going to put more restrictions on these power plants in the future. All of this will affect how much of this that we will actually see in the future in California. Right now, California is still the leader in biomass electricity, but all the new plants, there's one new one in Stockton, well, actually it's converted coal to biomass power plant. All the new ones are in other parts of the country. They're not happening in California. Some of the other technologies, pyrolysis technology. Again, we got the biomass going into our process. Pyrolysis here is really the conversion of a solid material, thermal decomposition at about 400 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit with little or no air or oxygen. This is basically how you make charcoal. It's a high heat producing volatile gases off of that solid and converting it into a charcoal product. Pyrolysis can produce this charcoal or char. Biochar is a popular name you're hearing a lot about. It can go into a soil amendment. The rules and how much and when you can use that are still being worked out. You can take that char and produce that torrefied biomass I talked about earlier. That's actually the process of getting to a torrefied fuel pellet. It also produces tar, those volatile organic compounds that are coming off of it at this high temperature are condensed and they form a tar. The tar can be upgraded into a bio oil. Problem with that sounds great, but this bio oil is not very compatible with conventional diesel oil. So you can't just mix it with diesel. You can run an engine off of this bio oil, but you can't drop it into the existing diesel fuel, mix it with current diesel. So that's a little bit of a roadblock with this technology. But you can also get a gas stream out of this that you can feed back into this and burn that gas stream, or that gas stream could even be a fuel for some secondary combustion unit, or take it into running a gasifier. So that's one stream pathway. We get this product of solid char. It has relatively low cost. It's a pretty simple process. It doesn't take a lot of extra technology or energy to run this thing. And it's producing us some decent products. And again, there are some downsides to that as well, particularly with the character, the properties of the products that you're producing. The gasification technology is getting lots of interest right now at a whole range of scales, from very small to very large. And there's a lot of research going on in this area. A lot of things are happening. It's a much more complicated process, but also it's one that's been around for a long time as well. Most of these things have been used for wood and for coal over, for 100 years or so. Again, our biomass going into the process stream, the gasification here, this is also operating at a higher temperature, much above the pyrolysis temperatures. Now we're getting up greater than 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, but we have very limited air or oxygen. So we're not combusting it, we're not going through that pyrolysis process. Now we're actually gasifying the solid. We're producing a gas out of it. The oxidant, depending on what oxidant you use, will determine part of the product that you get out in this product gas and the tar. We can use different oxidants, air or oxygen or even steam. You're producing a low BTU fuel product. It's called a product gas that has an energy content of about 100 to 400 BTUs per cubic foot. Compare that to natural gas. Natural gas is about 1,000. So you're about a third of what natural gas is in terms of energy content. But we can make a gas that can be used in other processes, burned in a boiler. It can go right into an internal combustion engine to run that engine. It can be through a gas turbine. It can be even into fuel cells. Or we can take that product gas through some more technology, particularly through catalysts, cleaning it up to a syngas and then using those catalysts to make liquid fuels that's our drop-in transportation fuel stream, where you can actually produce a fuel that will be very equivalent to existing gasoline product. So it can be a drop-in fuel. So it's a more complicated process. We're also getting not just that product gas of CO, hydrogen, and hydrocarbon gases. These are the ones that have the energy in them, but we're also getting these emissions of carbon dioxide, some nitric oxides, and water vapor. But we're also getting a char stream, and we're getting tar and particulates out of that process as well. And depending on what the technology is, you can tweak the temperatures, you can tweak the pressures, you can tweak the oxidants going in there. It all determines the quality of the product you're getting out and whether you're going to get a lot of tar or a little tar. Tar is not something you really want. There's a lot of energy in this tar, but it also gums up the works. It's tar. It makes quite a mess. Anybody who's worked with gasification units that produce a lot of tar knows what I'm talking about. So just comparing those two, the oxidation fluid, we can get different energy contents out of that. And the gasifier types are they're downdraft gasifiers that can work with a low moisture content feedstock, about 15%. They tend to be low in tar, and there is a scale issue. You can't go very large in these. They tend to be a smaller scale, up to maybe a megawatt in size for electricity production. Updraft gasifiers, downdraft and updraft really means is it going against the air current or with the air current? And that tends to be, can use higher moisture content feedstocks, but it gives a moderate tar level. The lowest tar we get in some of these fluidized bed systems that are now operating at higher temperatures and well, it's too complicated to describe in a few words, but the ones that we're going to really focus on in the smaller scale are the downdraft gasifiers. And it's basically operates something like this, where you have a zone of gasification in here with the feedstock coming in from the top, the air coming in from the bottom. So the downdraft is producing the gasification zone in here, and we're getting a gas out of this downdraft gasifier at the bottom, getting some ash, the char that's created out of that, and the tar is going to be tied up in that gas stream. Depending on where it goes, you may have to, I pushed the wrong button. Does it come back? I hate buttons. Thank you. Not time to really go into all the details, but you can see that, and this will all be available in the PowerPoints that are put online. We have lots of different ways of designing these gasifiers. The amount of tar we get out, the value of the product that comes out, the product gas that comes out is really dependent on the design of that gasifier, and the tar really does gunk up the works. Just kind of as a good overview, in the tar concentration, the direct fire well, yeah, these are how you use that gas, and there's really no limit to how much tar is in direct fired in a boiler. If it's in a reciprocating engine that has a tar concentration of about 100 milligrams per cubic meter that it can handle, gas turbines, very little tar in those. And if you're going to take that chemical synthesis of a syngas to some drop-in fuel, very little tar, you can have very little tar in that gas stream. So that means you have to clean the tar out of the gas stream. You're adding cost to it. Oh, thank you. I know how to do it now. And your costs go up. Tar is a big deal, which is why we keep focusing on it. As the temperatures go up, the amount of tar in the gas tends to come down. The lower temperature ones have high tar concentrations. The downdraft gasification is kind of an unusual, doesn't quite fit into that nice linear line. It actually is operating at a low temperature, but it's also creating a little bit lower tar amount of tar as well. Time's up. Let's end on this one then. This is comparing downdraft gasifiers, updraft fluidized bed, and at a very higher technology form of gasifier, the allothermal, where the heat energy to drive this. This is an endothermic reaction. It requires heat to make this go. We have to get the temperature up. These ones are burning some of the fuel to provide the heat. The allothermal is bringing the heat in from some other source, operating at a higher temperature. So this is kind of showing you what the capacity of what's available out there now. The downdraft gasifiers are operating in this neighborhood of up to about a megawatt of, this is the term of megawatt of electricity produced. And this is the gray bar, the brown bar, whatever that is showing you how much feedstock you need to actually produce that. And it's somewhere in the neighborhood of from about what is that, half to 12 bone dry tons per day to run a downdraft gasifier in this size range. When you get up to these, you're talking about, these are logarithmic scales, by the way, you're talking about 1,000 to 10,000 bone dry tons a day for a gasifier. That would be at that kind of a level. And there'll be pictures of things that are currently available in these small scales from different companies out there. Phoenix Energy has a 0.5 megawatt gasification unit down in Merced. That our first workshop took a tour of that facility. Runs about 60 tons of biomass a day through that. It's actually a gasifier that was made in India. So, you know, there's some good things coming out of gasification, but it is still a low value product that we're producing out of that. And the costs are going to be high to get there. We're looking at, for this SB 1122, at that scale of unit, we're looking at costs in the neighborhood of, you know, 10 to 18 cents a kilowatt hour. And if you can't get that from the agreement with the utilities, this isn't going to happen. So that's why they're looking at somewhere, you know, above 10%, above 14% actually for a kilowatt hour. So lots of issues to think about. We're not going to get into the more complicated, but it's just different facilities that are being built now in the country with this gasification technology using a variety of feedstocks. So we want to encourage more biomass utilization is my final slide. Right? Time for
Thanks.
a question or two?
Yeah, absolutely. Questions from
nobody
the
went to
audience.
sleep, so that's a good sign. Yes?
Are all your figures dependent on one type of feedstock, or which type of feedstocks are you, when you're making quotes? Is it hardwood, softwoods?
They're most of the numbers that you see out there are actually for softwood. But you know, I don't really do I haven't done the economic analysis to really compare what the differences are between. It really comes down to the cost that you're paying for the fuel. Hardwoods do have more energy content in them. So, you know, it's that economic balance equation that you have to look at. The cost of harvesting the hardwoods are often higher. And you're not going to find that lower value feedstock in hardwoods most of the time. It's mostly going to be a softwood feedstock. Most of the numbers you're seeing there are softwood based.
Other questions? Do we have any questions online at this point? All right. All right, everybody's
Great.
happily digesting all of this great information and their lunch.
Did I talk too fast? I had a lot to cover. Yeah, thanks. I got it. Are you next? So our next speaker needs no introduction because he's been introducing himself all morning. Peter, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, John. So I'm going to take it from where John left off with the technology and talk a little bit about some of the issues with building facilities, particularly focusing on this scale that might be eligible for the SB 1122 program. Particularly, I'm going to talk about issues related to transportation, both for the feedstock and also for co-products. Interconnection, which John has talked about a number of times, which is a complex and variable issue. And then also markets, both for primary markets, being electricity, and then also secondary markets for co-products. So just as a general frame for this discussion, I wanted to put this up. So economic viability is really kind of a theme of what we're talking about here today. And for these projects, as we've talked about and heard earlier, the scale really places these smaller projects at a little bit of a disadvantage compared to other larger scale facilities that have economies of scale and existing capital investments already made in them. So important in the economic viability is access to secondary markets, so that would be anything that the conversion process is producing that isn't primarily electricity. We heard some discussion of biochar, other types of heat utilization, any way that that facility can actually generate revenue from you know, byproducts of their primary production activity. So access to secondary markets is critical. Access to primary markets, so that's really the interconnection piece. Where on the grid can you place these facilities? Is there grid capacity to accept the power that's being produced by these facilities? And then feedstock proximity, as we've heard many times already today from Neil and others, the cost of transportation is really the largest component in the supply chain for these facilities. So locating close to your feedstock is obviously critical. To break it down a little bit further, this is the graph of harvesting costs. This is from Bruce Hartsoe at Davis. These are dollars per bone dry ton on the vertical axis here, and diameter at breast height. So this is for as the diameter at breast height goes up, generally the costs come down. So because the volume is square of the diameter, you get some substantial. That was for those mathematicians out there. I apologize, I got that one a little bit off. But basically, your unit cost of production goes down as the dBH gets greater. The different lines here. This is the transportation costs. So that's a 50-mile haul from the landing to a potential facility. The yellow line here is the chipping costs, skidding costs. This is characteristic. So this is unbunched. This would be something that's out in the woods from log length or manual felling and limbing on at the stump. And then this is from swing, boom, felling, and bunching. This is the actual processing of the tree at the stump. So, and this is around about what John showed you a price at the plant. So a lot of these, even at 50 miles, really don't pan out economically. We've kind of heard that story before. Interconnection costs are a real challenge and something that the folks that are working on SB 1122 are trying to figure out. A recent PG&E study found that 9 of 156 recent projects of small projects, that's under 3 megawatts, triggered substantial upgrade costs, greater than $300,000. So that's, you go to PG&E and you say you want to put a plant on their grid, and they say, okay, give us $300,000. That would be nice. You could plan around that if that was consistent. However, the actual costs for projects going onto PG&E's grid in their queue have ranged from 180 or 800,000 up to over 2.5 million. So there's a great degree of variability in the costs that a project developer could expect for putting their power onto the grid. It's a little bit hard to see, but what this is a map of Plumas County, and the reason I put this up is because they've done a nice job. This is from the consultant report to the Public Utilities Commission around SB 1122, and what they were trying to do here is show how much existing capacity is on the grid to be able to accept new electrons. And what you see here are the existing substations in Plumas County, and the size and color reflects the capacity at those substations to accept additional power onto the grid. So there's very little in Plumas County, despite the fact that if any of you have ever been to Plumas County, there's a lot of wood out there. This, however, is Humboldt County. There's several substations, quite a few with some substantial existing capacity. So this is to say two things. One, that there's substantial variation in the viability of your project regarding the existing infrastructure, depending on where you're located. And the other thing is to say that Humboldt County might have some potential here in terms of putting new projects onto the grid. So to move on to this issue of alternative and secondary markets, we've heard a little bit today about biochar. We'll hear some more later this afternoon. It's a very new and very booming market. We've heard prices as high as 70, 80 cents a pound for this stuff in the agricultural markets from producers right now. There's a lot of uncertainty about that market, whether it will continue, what the actual real market value of this in terms of its effect on agricultural production systems. But there's a lot of other secondary markets from electricity production. Obviously, heat. We've saw the slide from Terabella down in the Southern Sierra where they're using it to dry wood. That's pretty standard for forest products industry. But there are other heat applications. Brewing uses a substantial amount of heat. This is hothouse agriculture, an interesting case study in the Sierra foothills that recently closed after over 10 years of successful production, but using wood to heat greenhouse agriculture for tomatoes. This is at 3,000 feet in the Sierra foothills. This is a data center. Cooling is also a potential from the heat produced by these smaller scale facilities. So not to say that we're going to cool an Amazon data center with a 3 megawatt power plant, just to say that that is a potential as well, and there's some real value in that economically. Some just general considerations for success at small scale. As we've talked about before, the retail or the wholesale value of electricity is relatively low. Those plants right now are getting 8 to 11 cents a kilowatt hour. If you go to your utility bill and you see what you're paying, it's a little bit higher. The industrial users maybe have 15 to 20 cents per kilowatt if they're buying it off the grid. So if, as a plant developer, if you can site in a location where you can actually provide power to an existing user who's paying retail rates for power, you may be able to you don't have to depend on the utility to pay you the going rate on the utility. So you can get some real substantial incentive there economically. Utilizing the thermal aspect, Ted mentioned earlier, natural gas is actually relatively cheap. Nonetheless, it's worth looking at to offset natural gas. Propane is quite expensive, so if you have an opportunity where someone's using a substantial amount of propane and you can provide heat to that user and help them avoid the high cost of propane. At $8 a BTU for wood chips, there's a substantial advantage over 25 for a million BTU for propane. Co-products, as we already mentioned these, but black carbon or biochar, pretty uncertain market. Another market that's of interest is activated carbon. Activated carbon is used widely in filtration for water, both water and air filtration. Water treatment plants use anthracite coal as a filtration media. The products coming out of these gasifiers can have very similar physical properties to that filtration media. There's potential for this char to be used as a substitute in those markets. And then at the risk of being really overly pedantic and academic, basic economic test. What is if you're less than zero on the production costs, minus the conversion costs, minus the procurement costs, then you're not doing real well. Got to actually make some money. Sorry about that. That's not really necessary, but you never know. So some opportunities. What would a situation like this look like? And we'll have a little bit of a discussion of this a little bit later on with the folks from the Harbor District who are embarking on some interesting plans. A greenfield, so starting from scratch. What might you look at for improving the economics of a smaller scale facility? Maybe you have a 2 to 10 megawatt combined heat and power facility. Look at value-added wood processing. Is there wood processing nearby? Can you add value there by providing heat or additional utilizing that electricity? brewery, food processing, distribution hubs for chilling, hothouse agriculture, aquaculture, research and development. Some of the challenges with that obviously are the chicken and an egg problem, where you have a developer that can't get financing to build a facility without a guaranteed market for the product, and so if you don't, and then maybe a user of that heat that can't go and get a loan to build their facility because they don't have the plant in place yet. So there's some challenges with integrating these multiple industries in proximity from a greenfield standpoint. Retrofitting has some has some potential. Existing facilities like hospitals, schools, government facilities, a lot of them have boilers, a lot of them use heat or cooling. The opportunity to potentially install a small combined heat and power production to provide heat, or purely heat, pure boiler just to provide heat to some of these facilities. Some of the challenges there, the economics look really good potentially if you're comparing against fuel oil or diesel or propane. Challenges are if you've got load centers that aren't really amenable to noise and emissions from power plant, as Glenn talked about before. Schools, hospitals, a lot of times they're not going to be very excited about a new loud power plant that's going to be producing additional air emissions issues. And also existing facilities may also already have invested in their heat or electricity, and they have to sort of go through the whole capitalization and return on that investment before they can look at a new opportunity. So there's an important role, I think, at this stage in the development of this industry for local and regional government organizations, community organizations, to kind of help, if it's seen to be a value, a public value to have this industry go forward. There needs to be some commitment to assisting the development of the industry going forward, and that can be done in the form of preliminary site screening for existing loads and existing feedstock sources. We had a nice map from Neil of the historical mill locations, which are often very good locations for these kind of facilities. Planning and zoning. I know there's an ongoing process here in Humboldt to revision the general plan, and making sure that this is a priority in that process can really help in a lot of different ways by improving zoning flexibility and land use, providing grants, loans, and tax credits. And perhaps most importantly is the issue of public acceptance. As Glenn described earlier, the experience of the Blue Lake plant in dealing with their very close and very actively involved neighbors in Blue Lake. And then other stories we've heard around the state of facilities getting to a point of permitting their new facilities. And for example, in Lake Tahoe, the community came out in nearly unanimous voice saying, we don't want a biomass facility in Lake Tahoe. And so making sure that there's buy-in and support from the community is just absolutely critical to thinking about these projects going forward. In addition, infrastructure. So as I mentioned, these co-products, they all add substantial value and may change the pro formas of a facility. However, you've got to have infrastructure that can move those products to market, and that's an important consideration here in Humboldt County because of the geographic isolation. To summarize, highest and best use of wood biomass, so minimizing the amount of energy and dollars you have to put in, as we saw in John's slide, to generate value from that wood. So the highest and best use, whether it's solid wood or pulp, those are all really important things to think about. Before you start breaking it down to its energy or chemical components, can you add value in some other way? To a point, energy production from biomass is much more cost efficient and more efficient and cost effective at larger scales. There's just a simple physical, it's kind of just basic physics there. For Small-scale energy production, heat and co-products are really important to offset the high cost of conversion. Okay. I'll do that when I'm done. Regional economic development. So the planning, public outreach, and public education are really are critical as much as any of the technical economic issues. None of these things are going to go forward if people in the communities don't want to see them go forward. And my last slide is just this kind of, I took some liberties with my old professor, Brian Jenkins, very astute representation of economies of scale here. This is dollars per kilowatt in production and the size. So this is basically saying cost goes way down per kilowatt as you get a larger facility. And so I put over that what seems to be kind of my perception of where people are willing to accept new facilities. So you have a really narrow window of opportunity where there's very few new power plants in California, if any, that are going forward at this point. And if they are, they're meeting substantial public opposition. The only ones that seem to be generating public support and acceptance are really around this much smaller scale. So this is a really significant challenge that these facilities face going forward. So with that, I am done, and I'll take any questions that anybody has at this point. And for John or myself, I'll field John's questions too. Any questions?
What's meant by bone dry?
Bone dry is, or John, you can talk about that.
Bone dry means it has no moisture in, 0% moisture content. Yeah, that's kind of the standard for measuring fuel in biomass is 0% moisture content. So, and that's defined through standards on how you get to that. It's drying it at above the boiling point of water until it stops losing mass.
So we've heard yesterday that there are plants. The Blue Lake power plant is trying to get forward, and yet you just said that there are no new plants being done. I mean, we have optimism all over this room, and yet there are no power plants going forward. Why is that not happening, and how are we going to get this optimism that's in this room to get more power plants going? What are we going to have to do?
Father's not supposed to ask his son a hard question. It's in the rules. We'll both answer the question.
Even better.
Oh, it's a darn good question. The investment in power plants in California has just not been there. Is the banker still in the room? I don't know the answer to that question. Part of it has to do with power purchase agreements and how that whole structure, that is all structured in California, renewable portfolio standard, all of that factors into this. But I only know the end result is that we haven't had investment in new power plants since about, except for that one and two, there's two, maybe three that have been converted from coal in the last 5 years because they were burning coal, and that's just a no-no in California. So we have had those conversions, but one that's built from scratch, I don't know of one.
I'll just add really quickly to that. Yeah, well, Blue Lake is a long time ago, and there is a plant that's in an early stage of construction, but it is at a sawmill in Anderson, SPI, their flagship mill in Anderson. They have a very captive feedstock supply. The materials coming straight out of their mill and into their new boiler. So that's kind of an anomaly. And I would say also that SB 1122 is really an effort to try to carry that has moved through the legislature into the point of statute and into the PUC to try to actually to build and move forward with the industry.
And I actually misstated. Blue Lake was never coal. It was always biomass, but it's a restart. It's not a new plant. It's a restart. Their Buena Vista is what I was thinking of, which was a coal plant converted to biomass recently. We have questions in the back. Yes. I had one on the way in the back, and then we'll work our way forward.
Right here.
Do you still have that question?
So are we starting at 210 or 205?
I just really wanted to reiterate about having a really good power purchase agreement. We, in Fort Bragg, we're trying to attract our local brewery. It would be fantastic, but there's no way they're going to pair with us unless we can say, they might say, well, how do we know your biomass plant's going to not just shut down like the Blue Lake plant? So without a proper power purchase agreement, I think you're dead in the water. That's really the most important thing at this point.
Yeah, it is, and I can't answer as to why those are getting harder and harder to come by.
A quick comment and a quick question. I think we should put our optimism into the small scale, community scale development that's happening, where I think it's optimism would be most useful to distribute all of this wonderful power in the best way possible. And my question is, what about converting some of the old inefficient combustion systems to gasification? How difficult is that, and has it ever happened?
Converting the equipment from combustion to gas, I think it's better to start over than to try and convert it. I think we're going to hold up on the question because I think we're ready to go, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we're turning this
All right. Well,
part of the afternoon over to my
to Miss
favorite,
Optimism.
my favorite person in Humboldt County. Yana's going to take over.
All right. Well, what we get to do for the rest of the day is sort of think locally and try and figure out how we can crack this nut and put some more emphasis on our regional focus. So we have a whole slew of speakers coming up here, but I would like this to be interactive. I do have a specific time frame for each of these folks, and so if you look on the agenda, you'll see that we do have an opportunity for a good question and answer session at the end here. But if each of our speakers keeps it a little bit short, we'll be able to make sure we get a question or two after each of their presentations. So I'd like to start by bringing up Matthew Marshall from Redwood Coast Energy and Repower Humboldt, and have him give us some opening thoughts on this Let's Get Local theme. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Matthew.
All right, thank you. When I saw there was a moderator listed right above me, it's like, well, either I'm going to talk too much or they thought I was going to get into a fight with Gary, so I'm not sure which the expectation was, but let me figure this out. Yep. There we go. So just a little bit about who I'm with. I'm with the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, and we're a local government joint powers agency of the county of Humboldt and all the cities within the county, as well as the local water district. And we've been around for about 10 years with the mission of, on behalf of our member governments, of really looking at reducing energy demand, increasing efficiency, and promoting the use of our local renewable resources. Most of what we do is on the energy efficiency side, working with businesses and homes and local governments to do energy efficiency projects. But we also do some planning work, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, which in particular, the Repower Humboldt project, which we started a few years ago, and it's a partnership with the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State, and as well as working with PG&E. We got a grant from the California Energy Commission to really try to address the question, can we meet our local electricity demand with local renewable resources here in Humboldt County specifically? So really looking at what are the resources available, and are there ways to utilize those to really meet our local electricity demands? And it was focused on electricity. We also wanted to see how that interacted with transportation and heating demands as well, but the funding was specifically focused on electricity, so that was kind of the lens for the project. And so really the effort included a pretty comprehensive technical analysis that was led by the folks at HSU, as well as an economic analysis of looking at what's the cost of different technologies, different scenarios, and balancing that with environmental benefits and how many, what percentage of renewables we're really pursuing, and then also a public sort of stakeholder engagement process so that we weren't just kind of doing this as an academic exercise in a void, but really engaging relevant folks. That's one of our stakeholder meetings, and getting folks from the environmental community, from the business community, from forestry, energy sector nerds, and so really trying to get a diversity of opinions to kind of guide what the priorities should be for renewable energy development in the community. And the final plan is available on our website, along with some hefty, I think the stack of final documents was pretty thick as far as the technical, economic, stakeholder analysis reports, and all that's available online if people really want to dig into it. So we started out with saying, well, where's our energy coming from right now? And this is talking about primary energy use. So, before it goes into power plants, before it goes into our homes, before it goes into vehicles, it's really split fairly evenly, about a third biomass, about a third natural gas, and about a third petroleum for vehicle fuel. So this is all energy use, not just buildings, but also transportation. And, the natural gas is split about half for electricity generation and half for, on-site, domestic and commercial hot water and heating. And the other thing that's important to note when we're talking about environmental benefits is that 60% of the emissions comes from that petroleum slice, and it's really transportation is our big greenhouse gas emission source. And so while renewable electricity is great, the transportation sector is really where there's the hardest challenge to address as far as greenhouse gas emissions. Our electricity is already pretty clean. And as far as electricity, our current electricity picture is about half natural gas from PG&E's power plant on Humboldt Bay, and then about a third of that is from our local biomass power plants, and then the rest is some small-scale hydropower in the region, and as well as some imports, which are based off of economics. Basically, they don't run the Humboldt Bay power plant when it's cheaper to import power, so we've got a little bit of import-export capability, but overall, we're kind of constrained in that we can't import enough power to meet our local needs, so we have to generate power locally. But sometimes it makes more economic sense to import some. And this is also, I should note, based off of sort of the actual electrons flowing around in our community, which, as I said, is kind of constrained. The Blue Lake power plant actually sells power to San Diego, but obviously those electrons are not traveling down to San Diego. So this is kind of from an engineering perspective, not the economics of it, of who their power is contracted to. So the first step of the project was kind of looking at what is the local available resource, and then kind of doing a modeling exercise to see, well, okay, how could those resources be used to kind of fill in the gap to get us to a high percentage of renewable energy. And so we've got certainly a wind resource, which there's offshore wind, which is kind of an unknown quantity at this point as far as what the technology is going to allow and what regulations are going to allow. There's also onshore and kind of the Cape Mendocino, Bear River Ridge area. There's potential for offshore wave. That's a new technology as well. Biomass, I'm going to kind of focus on that, obviously, for the topic of today. And that biomass kind of increased potential capacity was based off of the Biomass Collaborative sort of estimate of what's not being used right now. I mean, the local mills are producing material which is generally being used, and so that number was based off of the stuff that isn't being used, that's either being burned out in the woods or left in the woods unaddressed and potential fire hazards. So saying, okay, let's look at that material that's out there not being used as sort of the theoretical expansion potential. And this is just kind of an example of the modeling. And so the folks at HSU did a pretty detailed modeling exercise. And so this black line here represents the actual kind of power demand, and this is projected out to 2030. So this is a typical week in November, kind of saying, okay, here's the electricity we need. And this is sort of the model would basically kind of build out different scenarios and look at, well, okay, how would those resources, if we expanded that? So here's expanding up to 160 megawatts of biomass. There's hydro, there's wave, there's wind. The natural gas power plant is sort of filling in the gaps when the renewables fall short, which is actually a realistic scenario here because PG&E built a plant that has 10, like 16 megawatt units that it can ramp up and down very quickly. So they can adapt from running one of those units part of the way to all 10 of them full blast. And so they're actually able to kind of adjust to variable renewables such as wind or solar, things that might be coming on and off sort of sporadically. It was fortunate that the PG&E chose to repower that way. One, it helps them meet our local demand since we are sort of isolated, and so they can be responsible for making sure that we've got power, but it has that additional benefit of in the future, if we do build out renewables, they can use that power plant in a way that's responsive to those renewables. And so a key point of this was the modeling kind of looked at the economics of it and sort of said, well, okay, what's the cheapest things to build out that can make the right mix of power to really meet our needs? And and biomass is really a key part of getting that. If we're going to go to a high percentage of renewables, it was really the big opportunity and a critical piece for kind of getting that baseload power met, so that when there's the intermittent things like wind or wave or solar, that there's still that kind of foundation. And so we looked at kind of 3 scenarios out to 2030, and these are kind of standard or sort of sample scenarios to not say, oh, the only way that it would work would be these exact percentages of biomass to wind to wave, and these were, there was some flexibility there, but these were kind of what the modeling produced of saying, okay, based off of these costs and these goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the lowest possible cost, these were kind of the scenarios that we looked at. And so the first is obviously business as usual. And so this is kind of like that pie chart I showed you at the beginning, which is the standard mix that we have right now, which is mostly natural gas, a good chunk of biomass, and then obviously we've got ongoing efficiency projects that are happening in the community now. Efficiency is usually the cheapest thing to do, so that's going to grow over time if we invest more. And so the second scenario is if we allowed a 5% cost increase to get the maximum greenhouse gas reduction benefit. And so based off of that 5% cost increase, you'll see that small-scale hydro, and this is like run-of-the-river eligible renewable hydro, not building new dams. So small-scale projects that qualify as renewable energy in California and that aren't blocking fish passage. You see the biomass section grows a fair amount, and then wind is the kind of a new component to the mix. And then if we allowed a 15% cost increase, the efficiency continues to grow, and then you get even more biomass. You get some wave potential in there based off of what people think the cost of wave is going to be. And you can see, the capacity of the natural gas power plant would stay the same, but it would be used very, very minimally as far as the potential to have almost 100% of our power come from renewable sources with just a 15% cost increase. Now, that cost increase has sort of two factors of it. One, that's assuming today's sort of typical cost, and it does not assume a cost for carbon, which is something that's changing here in California as far as cap and trade. So this does not assume a cost on carbon. And it also assumes sort of today's technology. While doing the report, the cost of solar was dropping so fast, they had to actually rerun some of the numbers and redo some of the figures in the final report because the price of solar kept coming down so much even while we were doing this study. The flip side of that is the biomass costs are based off of current biomass project costs, and that might not hold true if we're really looking to kind of develop smaller projects and use that forest material. Those costs might actually be significantly higher than what the current kind of business as usual biomass plants are experiencing. So another piece of that was that building out that renewable energy infrastructure would have the potential to create 1 to 300 jobs in the community, and by far biomass is the #1 job creator. It takes a couple guys to operate a utility scale wind power plant, whereas biomass has the whole fuel processing stream and folks working in the woods all the way to the power plant and fuel handling, and so it's very labor intensive, which from an economic standpoint, it makes it costly, but it also is a big job creator. So by far the big chunk of those jobs are in the biomass sector as far as the economic analysis part of it. So some of the key findings of that report were basically, and all the research that went into it, was that it actually is feasible to have the majority of our electricity come from local renewables. It's quite technically possible using current technology to have 75 to 100% of our electricity needs met by local renewable resources. So that was an unknown at the beginning of it, but it actually proved to be quite possible with even moderate cost increases using current technology. I just always have to say this because efficiency is always the cheapest thing to do, and so we're always going to be focusing on that, and that's sort of a no-brainer to do efficiency first before you build new generation. And so I have to preach that wherever I go. And then another kind of something that didn't necessarily need to come out of this study, but is a key point, is that looking at ways to get transportation and heating off of fossil fuels, if we're looking at overall greenhouse gas reduction, that those are critical things to do. And even if we had 100% renewable electricity, that wouldn't get us to state targets for greenhouse gas reduction. And so we really need to look at ways to address those other things as far as heating and transportation fuels if we want to get to serious deep greenhouse gas reductions. And a key part of that is biomass was also one of the top opportunities locally. And I'd just also say that a mix of options was really needed, that you couldn't just do biomass or just do wind, that it really was that mix of different resource types that made it possible to get to that. And they all obviously have impacts, and so the question is trading those impacts and those costs for the environmental benefits of not using fossil fuels and having local energy supply. So as far as next steps, on that biomass topic, for us, we're kind of energy guys, and so it's like, okay, there's this big resource, but it's easy to kind of look at it from an energy perspective if that's what your job is. And so we really wanted to say, moving forward, how can we have a biomass strategy that's driven by like restoration priorities, and really, a lot of the folks that are in this room that are from the forest management side of it and the restoration community, to say, hey, here's what we need in an energy project to make our work possible. And so, not to say, oh, okay, let's build a power plant and try to find a fuel supply, but say, let's look at a restoration challenge, and you guys all know this map, as far as the risk of fire and the need to treat landscapes to prevent catastrophic forest fires. And so to work backwards from the restoration needs and try to have the engineering folks design the energy projects, and so really kind of focus on that strategy, not just saying, well, let's build another 10 megawatt plant because that's what would get us to that goal of how many megawatts of biomass we want to have. The other piece of there was others that tie into the biomass. I'm not going to list all of the strategies since some of them don't relate to biomass, but another piece of it was just really focusing on, well, let's use waste to energy first if we're going to be looking at new technologies. Let's take something that's a waste stream, and that can involve dairy digesters and other sort of bioenergy resources that are waste products right now or waste streams, and look at those for energy. And then obviously also focusing on kind of the community scale was another priority that came out of the stakeholder engagement. People really want to see local scale and combined heat and power, which has efficiency benefits. And then obviously kind of engaging the community, which financing is a key part of that for local resources. And sort of a third tier of that was really saying, well, what can we do to sort of promote the research and development side of it? And obviously working with the Schatz Energy Research Center is a great opportunity here, because a lot of these things like saying, okay, well, we need to do small scale biomass. Well, what are the technologies out there that can really achieve that? And there's nothing that you can just buy off the shelf necessarily that's solving these problems. Otherwise, people would be out there doing it. And so really focusing on the research and technology side of it, as well as kind of the community engagement side to say, how can we really, not just say, look at all that stuff in the woods that's not being used, but actually come up with projects that are viable. So next steps, we got some follow-on funding, and we're going to be working with the Schatz Energy Research Center and the Blue Lake Rancheria to do a deployment project to kind of say, okay, let's take all the strategies that came out of this, planning process and not just have it be a report on the document, but really look to implement a pilot project in the Mad River Valley to deploy not just the biomass strategies that we're hoping to move forward, but other community strategies as well. And I'm not going to talk about that because Jana's going to be up in a little bit to talk about that project. So I think that's my last slide.
Thank you very much. This is, oh, there we go. Very nice. Well, I'm going to be responsible to time and hold Matthew's questions to the end and introduce Gary Graham Hughes from the Environmental Protection Information Center. So maybe Matthew can help me walk and talk and chew gum at the same time here. So this goes in your pocket. But I think that has given us a nice framework for thinking about how all the big parts fit together, from just the, in your back pocket, maybe, from the energy production side all the way down to how we utilize that in the North Coast. We're getting, oh good, we're getting our talk just loaded up here. You'll also note that we've got a break coming after Gary, and then we'll continue on in this regional forum to our final forum discussion after around 4:30. So, how are we doing here? Almost.
I can go ahead and get started.
Actually, you don't need that. You're on.
Okay. Can everyone hear me all right? All right, my name is Gary Graham Hughes, and I currently work as the Executive Director with the Environmental Protection Information Center. And as Peter brings up the first slide, I just want to say it's really an honor to be here. Peter just called me last week, though, and so I kind of scrambled to make the time available and also just to slap together a couple of slides.
Advance and pointer.
Nice. And I'm going to try to be pretty brief, really, to respect everyone's time. And what I really aspire to do right here with my presentation is share some perspective, a couple of ideas that should mesh with what Matthew just presented, in order that as folks hear the case study presentations through the rest of the afternoon, that you have a couple of parameters to really evaluate whether a project is truly renewable, sustainable, and really working towards the goals ostensibly that we have to respond to the global climate change and biodiversity loss crisis, which are interrelated. Quickly about EPIC, we were formed in 1977, a public interest conservation advocacy organization, community supported, members locally, regionally, statewide, nationwide. Our history really is rooted in efforts to protect the Sinkyone Wilderness in the headwaters area. And this question, what does EPIC do and how? We work to protect natural and human communities in Northwest California, And we use an integrated science-based approach where we combine public education, citizen advocacy, and this is the concept of environmental democracy, really ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to participate in decision-making processes that can affect our lives. This idea of civics or wildland civics as I present it. And lastly, if necessary, and it's a prerogative that we all have at our hands in the democratic processes, is to pursue litigation if necessary. I want to start right off the bat addressing some of what I believe are misconceptions that are widely held about the role of fire in our landscapes. And we need to understand that fire is less frequent but as natural as rain to our forest ecosystems here. And we need to dispose of the myth of catastrophic wildfire. We need to just get rid of that because it's inhibiting our ability to understand how fire is going to return to the landscape. And we are rapidly learning, the body of science, that high severity fire results in a very rare, very unique, and very important forest type. We need to celebrate that. We need to work from that premise if we're going to really find solutions. Another real question here, and I put this out to everyone, is how much you really feel the imperative of what we're facing in terms of global climate change. And I guess it's my job as the quote-unquote enviro flag-waving greenie in the room to say we're facing an emergency. And I wake up every morning and frankly, I'm a little bit astounded and a little bit terrified at the lack of courage of our leadership in this society. And I believe it's going to take some really major steps for us to ensure basically that humankind doesn't find itself facing an existential threat by the year, 2050 now, maybe sooner. Anyone who follows climate science knows it's happening really fast. Nevertheless, I don't want to throw a pail of cold water on the optimism in the room. This is a great opportunity. In challenges, humankind has always found whole new realms of talent and ability to express. So I'm going to be quick, though, just a couple of slides. Again, the goal is that you have some ideas to consider as you hear the case study presentations later. Big, wordy, this is the big picture thing. Considerations regarding biomass energy generation, the conservation of biodiversity, and the imperative of responding to the challenges of climate change. This is the big picture thing. Ostensibly, right, the pursuit of biomass energy is to respond to the climate change challenges. Well, distribution is the #1 question. We really have an obsession with generation. And we need to think about distribution. And the reason why I bring this up is I worked extensively in energy sector issues before I took my job at EPIC. Worked strongly in the global hydroelectric development field. And it's become apparent that the real solutions that people all around the planet are looking for are to liberate themselves essentially from monopoly around distribution. And the things that we saw this summer, for instance, with PG&E attacking net metering or intertie systems in Sacramento this summer is a sign that, I mean, that's insidious behavior because we need to address that. Distributed generation is the cornerstone really to creating a truly renewable energy future. Scale, again, I'm sure a lot of this is stuff that people have already heard, but more or less 10 megawatts is about the maximum size for generation that could be considered renewable. This comes from the World Commission on Dams. Taking a look, again, hydroelectric, industry that painted itself as renewable, continues to paint itself as renewable, but we know that the only kind of hydroelectric energy that's renewable is small projects. Much can be said for others. Forest management that reduces the current biomass pool is not going to result in emission savings. So if we're depleting the biomass of the forest, it's not going to help. Substantial risk of sacrificing forest integrity and recovery to maintain or increase energy use. We know that there's a lot of people coming, right? By 2050, we'll be 9 billion on the planet. So there will be an increase in energy use, but we need to think about how it happens. We need to look at all the alternatives. And that includes looking, especially here in the Redwoods, what the real potential is for carbon sequestration, what it would really mean to nurture a landscape that could help us respond to this climate crisis. And then, frankly, human behavior modification is inevitable. We either decide how we're going to modify our behavior, or it's going to be decided for us. Just really quickly, a little bit of forest ecology to keep in mind. Forest debris matters. Coarse woody debris has an important role in biochemical cycling and ecosystem function. And if you don't keep that in mind, then you're just going to be taking, as we see with all the different human economic activities happening here on the North Coast, we have a very degraded forest ecosystem. It's a patient. It's on the floor. We're supposed to be doing first aid for it, not, draining blood out of it. Keeping forest debris in place improves soil fertility. It's clearly an important source for nutrients. It cools the soil and impedes soil breakdown and the release of carbon. Keeping forest debris in place improves soil moisture retention. Something else that's not really spoken about in the biomass discussions that we need to consider with climate change is forest productivity going to decline in the future. We're looking at a drier climate. How is that going to affect productivity? Can we just assume that the forest is going to continue to be as productive as it has been? Inhibiting the establishment of invasive species. Invasive species are one of the 3 most important factors leading to biodiversity loss. Again, biodiversity, climate considerations, it's all integrated. So if you can't throw biodiversity out the window in your attempt to respond to emissions. And then lastly, to remember that a sanitized forest is not a healthy forest. Okay? So if we go about trying to clean it all up and get all the branches out of the way so that we can generate some electricity and the forest looks clean, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's healthy. So let's keep in mind that what I've said here can, I believe, without having heard the case study presentations but being somewhat familiar with the projects, I think some of what I've shared here will confirm the viability of the projects that you'll hear about this afternoon. And we'll see that they're being conceived of with the ideas that I'm sharing with you here. So and then also if you mesh this with much of the information that Matthew just shared, you will find he made a comment, oh, like we're going to fight, but you'll find that we're really way more on the same page than we are off that page. And as well, EPIC we don't have a lot of resources. We specifically don't have resources to engage on energy issues, but we have put energy to work on this, and we did provide comments to the Repower Humboldt draft, and we do want to stay engaged on that, and we'll continue to do so from this angle where we're looking at what are the implications for forest, streams, wildlife, and of course our own community. So please check out our website, wildcalifornia.org. Again, I'm really honored to be here today. I regret not having been able to dedicate the entire day to the workshop, but thank you, Peter, very much for giving me that ring. And if you feel inclined, go ahead and approach me later, and I'll answer some questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gary. So we do have time for a couple of questions from our 2 speakers we just had, if anyone has something that they would like to get into this conversation with. Anything that anyone would like to start us off with, or should we just move on to break? And all right, got a question.
So does it sound like EPIC is against biofuel?
I don't think that would be. I don't think that would necessarily correctly convey what I'm trying to say, because I believe there's opportunities in, especially if you were to mesh what I was saying with many of the slides that Matthew shared. This idea really of keeping an eye out for how to take advantage of waste. There's no doubt that the timber industry over the decades has worked really hard on energy efficiency in that taking care of waste. So I think we want to be continuing to explore those possibilities. And then if we looked at distributed generation, really community scale things, and then again, listen to some of the presentations for the case studies this afternoon, and you'll see that some of these projects actually fit within these parameters of what we're speaking of as well. So I would be hesitant to say that we're categorically opposed to the use of wood bioenergy for electricity generation, but I would firmly say that we believe and are working to see that our forests are nurtured in a way that they can be realizing their full potential in responding to the global climate and biodiversity crisis.
Okay. Using the newer technology that on gasification and fast pyrolysis, Obviously, these two new technology produce biochar. How do you see that the biochar, in response to your concern on the nutrients and also retaining the moisture in the forest and all that?
And just really quickly to note, as I had stated, that we provided comments to the repower draft. It was specifically those technologies that we felt have the greatest potential.
And I was just going to add on the topic of, supporting, biomass or not supporting it. It was interesting in our stakeholder process, which I mentioned was pretty, we tried to not just stack the deck with a bunch of people that were, environmentalists, so to speak, and really, try to get business folks and industry folks involved. And the number one criteria as far as evaluating projects for that group, we thought was going to be jobs or something like that. And it was actually environmental benefits, which made sense because the whole point of doing renewable energy is to help the environment, and so first you must do no harm, and so that was really the main criteria that not just the environmental community really felt should be the critical lens for these kinds of projects, is saying, okay, let's make sure that we're not just doing renewable energy because it's blanketly the right thing to do. And I think the large scale hydro is a good example because it's something that has had negative impacts, and what that right scale is I think is something to be explored, but I think there's agreement that that really needs to be the priority, since that's the whole point of doing these projects, is to help the environment.
Probably have time for one more question here.
Hi, Gary. Jim Zolik from the Shots Lab. I'm just curious what EPIC's position is on fuel reduction efforts and sort of the type of things that I think you weren't here for the morning session, but we heard different speakers talking about some of the efforts locally with regards to fuel reduction. Whether or not, I mean, obviously today we're talking about using that material potentially for an energy project, but there's a lot of challenges to that, and sometimes that's not possible, but there's still a desire, I think, to do these fuel reduction efforts, and I was wondering what your position is on that.
Well, yes, for instance, as far as projects on public lands go, to be very brief, pre-commercial thinning is necessary. And there's instances where logging from below can help move forests towards the conditions that we're really looking for. The question of how those materials that are being used can be best utilized to meet our goals in responding to global climate change, I think is at play, and it may depend upon the site. It may depend upon the opportunity. There may be instances whereby, yes, it's much better to find a way to return that woody debris to the forest ecosystem, and there may be other instances where it makes sense to use another technology. There may be even another instance where generating electricity, if the transportation costs, both for emissions and economy, weren't too much. So, I want to demonstrate with this that we really believe it's kind of a case-by-case situation.
I'm going to sneak one more question in here.
Thank you, Ted Bielek, Forest Products Lab. Matthew, in the repower report, you showed a graph that had 3 different distribution scenarios under different cost or different additional costs. Mm-hmm. In that, did you have a breakdown of the capital costs that would be required for each of those 3?
Yes, yeah, and that's where the really thick documents come in, as far as looking at what's the levelized cost of energy and the capital costs, and looking at what average industry costs are, and using those to kind of predict what that would be locally. And so there's quite a bit of detail that wouldn't fit in even an hour-long presentation that went into that background info, and that's all online.
Okay, well, I'd like to give these speakers a nice round of applause. They did a very nice job. And I appreciate everyone sharing their truth here. So we're going to take a break.